talk about the dead bee slide. I always yell at Kim for giving me the dead bee slide.
Yeah, that was a dead bee.
Yes, it's a dead bee slide. So, and actually, because this part is sort of geared more towards pesticide applicators. Do we have anybody here who has a pesticide license? Okay, a couple people. All right, so we'll keep going along that line, and if we need to go off, then we certainly can. So when we talk about honeybee health, pollinator health in general, I've always really liked this slide because it shows a lot of the different things that are affecting the honeybees, and pesticides is one of them. And that's something that if you use pesticides, it's part of the problem. It's one of the issues that are affecting honeybees. There's a lot of different things. There's varroa, there's lack of forage. Genetics have been sort of kicked around in there. Diseases. I don't know, you all may have already heard this, but with varroa, it's like having a dinner plate attached to you, sucking the life out of you and giving you disease. That's not very fun. You're already weakened. So if you're coming up against some of these other challenges, what kind of defense do you have? Or, with the pesticides, is that affecting the health, and then they're coming up against other challenges. So it's really a lot of different things that are sort of dealing with honeybee health. But for this particular situation, in this particular talk, we'll talk about the pesticide end of things. And so, does everybody here have bees? Yes? Does anybody not have bees? Okay, so then I'll show you these slides. These are my favorite slides to show, especially to show to people that don't keep bees. And I'll show you why. So this is your typical apiary. Most people are used to seeing these kinds of, the many hives, white boxes. There's Ken. Ken, I bet you didn't know you were in this until she sent this to you. This is a moire hive. I always think that sounds very fancy, moire. But it's a smaller hive. It's about the size of a laptop. This doesn't really give it much justice in the picture. This is a top bar hive. So it opens from the top. Most of you guys already probably know all this. There's a picture. That's another picture of the moire. There's another hot type of hive. That one looks like it could have been homemade. I've seen them do this in plastic 50-gallon drums as well, with little frames. That's a Slovenian hive, and so you take the frames out like a book off of a shelf. Those are pretty hives. The Mona Lisa is always my favorite, and I always show these because I say to people that are not used to, that don't have bees and may not be in the bee world, if you were to see the Mona Lisa next door, would you know it was a hive? And most people say no. And I think that's really important to make people realize to open up their line of vision, especially when we're dealing with pesticide applications. Because it's not just your regular Langstroth white box hive. There's lots of different kinds. This picture I always like to show because it shows the nice property line with the fence right there and the hives on the other side of the fence, which for some of the crowds that I teach to is really important for them to realize that there's something on the other side. These are on city roofs. This was on the top of a garage. This was actually from a bee kill complaint that we followed up on. So hives come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, and designs. And so it's really important for people that are using pesticides to open their eyes and be aware of the different types, the different shapes, just that they're out there, and it's about asking questions, communicating, and opening the line of vision. So, you can't talk about honeybee health without hearing about neonics. So, for a lot of people, when you say neonicotinoids or neonics, they don't know what products they are because neonics are a class of chemical. And there's six or seven active ingredients that are classified as neonicotinoids. And those 6 and 7 chemicals are in multiple different types of products. So these are some examples of product names. imidacloprid is one of the most commonly used neonicotinoids. And so it's in things like Electus, Merit, Malix, Marathon, Premise. Merit is probably one of the more common ones that you might have heard because it's on homeowner shelves. Methoxam, dinotefeneron, I'm probably killing some of these names, diacloprid, and acetamiprid. Those are neonics. So currently what's happening with the status of neonicotinoids on the federal level is EPA, who registers the products on the federal level to start before they get registered on the state level, does a registration review of all actives every so many years. So the neonics were just about up, but a couple years ago when everything started happening and neonics were getting looked at, they pushed the reg review up a little quicker than it was actually up for review. So they've been reviewing the neonics. They started with the imidacloprid. I think they're working their way down to a couple other of the actives. When we talk about reviewing, they're looking at a bunch of different things. There's 4 phases, I believe. Their conclusions, I guess, or their findings get posted for public comment. They take those public comments into consideration as well. Everything then gets posted on EPA's website, so you can take a look at it. They actually had a webinar after their first phase was done to sort of explain the process. I think they're in phase 3 right now, with at least with the imidacloprid. At the end of it, they'll make decisions on whether or not to keep all neonics, certain neonics registered, whether or not to sort of alter labeling, restrict labeling, so on and so forth, restrict use patterns, things like that. They're hoping to have all of these decisions by 2017. And so that's where the neonics are on the federal level. But, oh, here it is. Here's the schedule. So if you were to type in, if you were to Google EPA neonicotinoids, it's going to bring you right to their website, where you can click on things and find the webinar and so on and so forth. But it's not just about neonics. When we talk about pesticides and bee kills, you kind of have to split it up. It gets tricky. It's not necessarily cut and dry. You deal with the acute toxicity where you've got a large amount of dead bees out of the blue. And so that's something where it could potentially be the bees were exposed to something, they came into contact, something drifted, something happened, and large amount of dead bees. Then you get into some of the sublethal stuff, which is your slow decline. And from an enforcement standpoint, that's a lot harder to determine. And so that's sort of the challenges that we're up against on the state level, and up against, to be honest with you, all around, to figure out sublethal doses. We know what the acute doses are, but sublethal is very tricky. Also, is it a synergistic effect? Is it a number of different things that have, weakened the bees, and then over the edge, or was that what weakened them, and then the varroa came in, and so it gets a lot trickier to sort of figure out. And it's not just neonics. When we're looking at things. My concern, and I've said this all along, my concern with people focusing on neonics is they're going to forget about everything else. As an applicator, people cannot just be like, oh, it's not a neonic, it's fine. That's not the case. And your labels will actually indicate that. So, put all the pollinator health issues aside, labels have had bee language on them forever. If a product has bee toxicity issues, the label will reflect certain instructions on how that applicator is supposed to be applying that product. How, when, and where. That is nothing new. That has always been the case. Neonic or not, always been the case. And pretty much the language is very much the same. Do not apply this pesticide or allow it to drift to blooming crops or weeds. If bees are visiting the treatment area, be cautious. caution, may keep honeybees. These are all things that have been on the labels for quite some time. But specifically with the neonics, EPA asked the registrants to put these little bee boxes on the label to make it a bit more obvious that the product was toxic to bees. To sort of be a bit more flashy for the applicator to look a little bit more. I mean, at the end of the day, the applicator has to read and follow the label regardless, but EPA asked specifically for neonics to put this on their label.
One difference also though with the neonics is because they can be sort of applied systemically.
Right.
Yep. That's different than like, you know, I guess what you had diazinon, whatever. But so like if you buy some shrubbery at Lowe's or whatever, I think that it's like 5 years. So.
Well, I mean, I never speak to the toxicity about things in the sense that unless we know exactly what the label is, I have the product is, I have the label right in front of me, and I'm not the tox girl. We got somebody in the office that's the tox guy.
Yeah.
I always say I'm the law girl. But one reason you're absolutely right, why neonics are getting looked at is one of the reasons is because they're systemic.
It's a whole new ballgame because of that factor. So it really is.
They're systemic and they're used quite readily. They hit the market and they became very popular because they had lower toxicity on other things.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of, you know, it hit the market and it blew up. Systemically, people liked to use them because they were systemic. They didn't have to make multiple applications. And so that's one reason why they're getting looked at. Again. So when we talk about pesticide applications, I always talk about integrated pest management, which is nothing that, it shouldn't be forgotten. IPM is something that's pretty standard practice, I think, now. When I started about 16 years ago, it was sort of like the new flashy term, and integrated pest management. It's basic, I mean, it's common sense, really. Know what you're applying for, know what your thresholds are. Take a look at the whole picture and pick the right tool for the problem. And the whole picture could be a lot different for this person to this person, depending on the scenario, depending on what's around. And it's about making changes and altering, whether it's changing products, whether it's changing method of application, whether it's changing times, whether it's, you know, working with the scenario, making the best choice for everything. For whatever you're growing, whatever you're treating, but also for what's around you in the environment, yes.
But aren't some of the neonics just applied prophylactically?
Some of them are used so your neonics are insecticides, and when it comes to integrated pest management, some of them are used as sort of a pre-treatment in a sense, but when we talk about integrated pest management, there is the factor of if you've had that particular pest and it's very persistent, there's a good chance you're going to be having it next year. And when you're making those choices, you also have to think about thresholds, and sometimes your threshold isn't very big before you might decimate a crop. And so that's part of the choices that people have to make when they're deciding what to treat, where to treat, how to treat, and what product to use. And so it can get tricky, absolutely. It can get very tricky. But those are choices that the individual has to make.
What about the buildup in the ground and runoff in the groundwater with the neonics?
That all depends on the product and the toxicity of that. And to be honest with you, again, I typically kind of shy away from the toxicity questions because that's why we have somebody in the office to talk about that. And it depends on the type of application, whether it's a granular, whether it's a spray. All of those things come into play as far as runoff, buildup, things like that. Exposure to sunlight, non-exposure to sunlight, things like that all factor into play. So without knowing specific products, and when we talk about neonics as an active or as a class, we also look at the active. So an active, like imidacloprid, is in the class of neonicotinoids, and imidacloprid is in a product, which is a much bigger thing, and bigger in the sense that there's dilution rates, which means that that product gets mixed at a certain rate. So when we're dealing with toxicity, that's why I kind of go to Hudson that can kind of answer some of those questions, because we try to get very specific when we start talking about toxicity, as far as dilution rates, application rates, the type of application, so on and so forth.
Isn't that part of why the EPA right now is re-examining the whole issue on this particular pesticide, class of pesticides, is because they're trying to answer those questions?
They are. I mean, it was going to be up for review in about a year or two, but yes, they are looking at that because neonics have been, because they're systemic, because, you know, of the fact that they are used so much, and because of some of the studies that have been out there, EPA is reevaluating and looking at them specifically for bee pollinator issues. Toxicity is a very complicated topic, which we could always get Huts out here to dive into it. But it gets very, very complicated. So with IPM, you know, when we talk to the applicators, you know, it gets back to some of the best management practices as well of, you know, make good just choices. Read your labels. Know your products. If somebody's not reading the label, that's a whole bunch of violations, but aside from the violation end, you don't know what you're using. Is it systemic? Is it a residual? Will it hang? Will it last for a while? If it is a residual, how long does it last? Does it break down fast? Is it a contact kill? Know, you know, we always stress to people to know the products, know what they're using. Be aware of weather conditions, because that's going to affect how long something might last, whether something will dry. A lot of these products are more toxic when they're wet versus when they're dry. So if it's a hot, humid day, and somebody makes an application and it's not going to dry as fast, you know, that's something that these guys have to take into consideration. Know basic bee biology so that people can be more educated about these choices that they're making. Opening the line of vision, again, everybody laughs when I say this, but I'm like, if you're driving down the road and you see honey for sale sign, you know you probably somebody's got bees in the area. So, you know, keep that in mind. Just those little things can kind of help make somebody make choices. Timing, application methods, all those come into play, and things that we stress to make sure that people are understanding. So, what happens when we get a call? And this is what a lot of people are usually interested in. So, what happens when we get a quote-unquote bee kill call? EPA put out a guidance document for the pesticide sort of divisions for all the states on how to assess pesticide risks and how to basically give some suggestions on how to follow up for a bee kill. So, right now in Massachusetts, how it works is that if we get a bee kill call, ideally we want to get it vetted through the apiary program first. And we actually have a list of questions that either a pesticide inspector or an apiary inspector will ask to try to start figuring out what happened. If at that point we feel that there's a potential that it could be a pesticide kill, we want an apiary inspector and a pesticide inspector to go out together to assess the hive. Once they go out and the apiary inspector cracks open the hive, it's at that point that there'll be a decision made on whether or not it should be followed up as a pesticide complaint. And if it is, then that's where sampling comes into play and the inspectors start doing their job, following up on it as a complaint. The apiary inspectors will take the samples for the pesticide inspectors. We actually just had a field day a couple weeks ago with the two groups. So the apiary inspectors were showing the pesticide inspectors the hives. The pesticide inspectors were sort of instructing them on how to collect samples if we have to go out there. It's a very set process on how things have to be done. And it was a really great, I think it was great to have everybody working together. So going forward, you know, it'll be even more of a collaborative event. And we've done this for last Last year was the first year that we really started working with the apiary inspectors when it came to bee kill complaints. And so we'll go out, or will, I would say will, I'm not an inspector anymore, but yes.
How quickly can they get to the site when there is a bee kill complaint?
Well, we want to get there as soon as we possibly can. Time is of the essence, is what we tell people. So ideally, we want to try to coordinate so the two can go out together, but if we can't get out there in a quick enough time, then one will go out with the other and start. So, I mean, ideally, we want to get out there within a day or two. Because time, for us, when we collect samples and run samples, the faster we can get out there, the better quality we collect, the more information that's going to give us.
Can the beekeeper themselves like help by taking a sample or?
So, if you, we appreciate it, however, and often we do, often the beekeeper will have collected bees already and frozen them, and we can take that as part of the investigation, but we cannot rest an enforcement action on that sample results, because there has to be a chain of custody, and there has to be very strategic ways that we collect the samples so that there is no cross-contamination, and we can say from point A to point B, this is what happened. Because if there's ever a case where there's an enforcement action, and somebody wants to fight that enforcement action, the first thing they're going to say is, how did you collect the sample, and was it in your possession at all times?
They'll attack the chain of custody.
They absolutely will.
So
And
it's in their beekeeper's best interest
to call us right away.
It keeps
To
the
have
integrity
a-
of the investigation.
It really does. It really does. And I know it can be really frustrating for people because they want to collect something, you know, they want to grab it right then and there. And we appreciate that, and we will take that, but we can't hang our hat on it.
If somebody can come out within a day or two, I mean, that's,
We really do our best to get out there as soon as we possibly can. These are complaints in general take precedence over any routine inspection. Bee complaints have gone
it's good to know.
even more so. Yeah, I mean, that's always been the case with the pesticide enforcement team. Any complaint that comes in, especially where we feel like we have to sample, that goes above and beyond any routine inspection that we have to work with. And if that means somebody that lives in this territory, or works in this territory over here has to drive all the way over here, because these guys have other things going on, then that's what happens. So we really do make sure that we get out there as soon as possible. Yes.
What types of enforcement actions are possible? Like,
So, we can do a number of things. We can do letters of warning, we can do administrative orders, we can put conditions on licenses, suspend licenses, revoke licenses.
That's providing they have a license to begin with.
That's providing they had a license to begin with, you're absolutely right. Depending on the situation, on the violation, there are other avenues that we can travel as well. Whether it's through the Attorney General's office, whether it's through, again, it depends. Sometimes we do extend outwards of the department to different levels as well, to sort of where we work together on something, again, depending on how severe the situation is. Again, depending on the situation, there can also be fines involved. If it's an administrative order that was violated as well, that's $25,000 per day per violation. So there's a number of things that we can do enforcement-wise.
Where is the testing done?
So our lab is located at UMass Amherst. It's at the Mass Pesticide Analysis Lab. And so actually that's a good segue.
good question.
And what's the, in general, in other words, I know you can't give specific instances, but given the bee kill calls that have been answered, what's a rough percentage of them that have tested positive,
Positive?
so to speak?
We have had,
And what did you find?
we had, okay, so the first, I've been doing this for 16 years. I started in 2000. The first year that we ever had a bee kill call was in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2014, we had I think we only had 2 or 3 calls with 2 positive, where we could coordinate the application, an application of a pesticide to the bee kill.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, I don't think we had some bee calls, but I don't believe we had any positives, any detectable limits last year. This year, already we've started to follow up. We had one detectable limit, but it was in spring. It was a fungicide, which gets to this screen that we're going to talk about. And they were super, super low levels, and there isn't any fungicide applications that are being done that early. And there were a host of other issues going on with the hive, so we kind of are suspecting that it was brought back in the pollen from outside. Yes.
I'm in Rhode Island. I was just wondering if the, like, what's considered a toxic level is different state to state?
No, it's not necessarily, no, because there's acute toxicity levels that's associated with pesticides. There's a part per million, or actually part per billion usually, that's associated with a chemical for acute toxicity. And so that's where it gets really interesting when we do get detectable levels, because then we've got to look at the levels and say, okay, well, is this what killed the bees, or is this something that we found, or is this something that may have contributed? And so that's where we get to our toxicologist, where he takes a look at that. We also look at the apiary inspector's report as well to see if there's anything else going on in the hive. And we try to make sense of it. Sometimes you can't always. And that's just sort of the fact of it when you start getting into sublethal doses. As far as, is this what actually killed the bees? Or was this just in the hive because they're collecting pollen and nectar from other plants?
Do you ever test the levels of pesticides in the wax?
We collect everything we can. So yes, in some cases, yes. If we collect dead bees, bee bread, honey, we do white samples if we feel that's necessary, vegetation samples. I mean, we collect everything that we could possibly collect when we go out to do an inspection. And what we do is this screen. So whether we know what was used or not, we always run what we call Z-screen. And this Z-screen has changed. This year, it changed from last year. They actually took some older chemistries off because they're not really used very much, and we put on some fungicides that are commonly used, and we also added some miticides as well. So it's got neonicotinoids, organophosphates, pyrethroids, carbamates, which are all your insecticides and fungicides as well, because we started seeing that some studies and information out there that fungicides and miticides, or fungicides and insecticides, are having a synergistic effect potentially. And so we did this screen again because you can't always collaborate an application with a bee kill, and so which is also something that's very new to our enforcement division. And so we did a screen to see if, all right, we'll see if there's anything in there, and regardless of the levels, it is good information for us to have.
Is glyphosate something that you test for?
Glyphosate at this point is not something that we test for.
Interesting.
Mean Roundup,
Yeah.
basically?
Yep.
Now, I have a question.
Yes.
If you're an applicator, you have to get a pesticide license, you have to get your credit, you have to be educated.
Yes.
What about the people that are going to Home Depot?
Yeah, that is.
You know, the ones that there's no regulation on them. You find a lot of those things right in your local department store, and the regular homeowner goes home.
Yep.
Or puts 7 because they think it's good for the garden, but it's not good for the.
Right.
So those are people you know, how do you reach those people? Because they're probably doing more collective damage than any agricultural activity is doing.
That is a constant challenge. The homeowner level with pesticides is a challenge that is constant for not just that reason, but for other reasons as well. Not that this usually gives people much more of a peace of mind, but they are required to read and follow the label. Not only under the state level, but also the federal level. And we do follow up on homeowner complaints. So this is the other thing, is people think that we don't follow up on complaints that regard, homeowners and neighbors and things like that. We do a lot of those. We can't knock on every person's door and say, show us what's in your garage. We just don't have that authority. And the regulations, you're absolutely right, the regulations pertain specifically to people that are using them commercially or in an agricultural setting, but not so much on the homeowner level.
And there's far more homeowners than there are agricultural applicators.
It's definitely a challenge that we've had and I can understand the frustration.
For the lists that you have for the testing, do you
Yes.
have the reportable limits also publishable?
No, we don't, because sometimes it depends on the active ingredient, but there's also other factors that come into play with the detectable limits, as far as the equipment that's being used, as far as the matrix that it's coming in as well, whether it's wax or bees or honey or that sort of thing. So it's not always a set limit of detection. The limit of detection is always going to be lower than your acute toxicity level, though. So it will always be, it should always be below that. But you're going to find a limit of detection with any place that you go. And usually the detection limits are in the parts per billion, and they're usually relatively low.
Do you have the acute limits posted?
It all depends on the active ingredient. You can get that information out there, but it all depends on the active ingredient itself.
Okay, so you guys don't have a spreadsheet or anything that you can get from
We
the
don't.
website?
I don't know, I'd want to say maybe EPA would, but I'm not entirely sure.
Even if you had the ability to read it and interpret it, you would need a degree.
Well, and this is why I always say, like, I try not to be the talks girl. I can read and understand regulation and laws much, because that's how my mind is trained, but we have people in the office that do that. So when we get those positive results, so for those two that we got positive results at, one of them was a very, very commonly used product. And yeah, we had the application happen on the site, and yeah, that individual was using a product that had the active ingredient that we found in the bees, but it's used everywhere. So, we're thinking, okay, if we're going to do an enforcement action, we need to cover all our bases. And so the thought was, well, these things can go miles, And it's that time of year where people are spraying and doing this and doing that. And so that's where Hutzie came in, our toxicologist. And we said, Hutz, based on these levels, do you think it was this application that did this damage? And he said, yes, because the levels were high enough to where they weren't flying home if they got exposed to it somewhere else. And so that's the great thing about some of this, is you can kind of start to whittle it down a little bit. But that is not always going to be the case. And it's not always going to be the case that we're going to be able to point to, if we do find positive lethal doses, acute doses, that we're going to be able to point to that person as the one that did it. And that's just, unfortunately, the reality of it because of the distance that they fly. But we do everything that we possibly can to try to figure that out. And that's where the inspectors come into play. That's where they do their investigations. And that's where they try to look for everything that they can to try to make a connection. And they don't just wait for the results to come back to do that. They do that all while they're waiting. So these are the most complicated investigations that a pesticide inspector has to work with and follow up on.
Legal and regulatory question. Is there any discussions of limitations for homeowners on purchase limits?
Purchase limits?
Correct. Like for, just as an example, for like drugs, dextromethorphan. You can't buy it and they keep track of it.
Right.
Is there any talk of anything like that so you know how much people are buying?
No,
Okay.
there's not. Not as far as quantity is concerned.
Okay. I know it's difficult because somebody could have half an acre, somebody could have 10 acres.
Yeah.
But it's just where some people have to pay for licenses to handle their 10 acres. A private person can purchase whatever they want, whenever they want, and use it however they want.
I mean, I will say this, there is some legislation that is in whatever process it is in at this point, that speaks of sort of limiting neonicotinoid use.
Okay.
Oh, Dagobah's bill. Yeah.
Yep.
So, if something like that came down the pipeline to regulate homeowner use, would that be something that would end up under MDAR as far as
Yep.
enforcement
Yep.
and so forth?
Yep, it would.
Is the possibility of just selling single-use containers of the pesticides to consumers being looked at?
That would fall on EPA's shoulders because they deal with the production of the product, which also includes the packaging. So a good example of that is rodenticides. So EPA years ago sort of redid some of their rodenticide packaging, depending on the type of rodenticide it was, to limit sort of the types of rodenticides that homeowners, I mean, they could still get, if they really wanted to, get what they would want, but they tweaked the packaging so that hopefully a homeowner wouldn't want to buy a 4-pound pail of rodenticide. Instead, they're going to buy the rodenticide that comes in its little, contained packages. So that has to come, when we're dealing with packaging and the amounts, that can be sold on a marketplace, that usually falls within EPA because that's part of the producer end of things, and they regulate the actual manufacturer. Yes?
So if you actually go out to a retail site and take samples, does the person whose apiary that is get a report back on what was tested, what was found?
Yep, absolutely. So every case that we follow up on from a pest, and I mean, if it's just a general bee inspection, hive inspection, we get a report at the end of it. When it becomes a pesticide complaint, we do a whole investigation and create a whole entire file. And when samples are collected, once we get those results, once we come to our conclusion one way or another, if it is an enforcement action that we do issue, the complainant gets a copy of that enforcement action. So which lies out basically the whole investigation. And then if not, you'll get a conclusionary letter with the results attached to it. Yes?
Do the results fall under the public record?
They do. Yep. I mean, our whole investigation falls under the public record. I mean, certain personal information has to get redacted, but it's all, we're a state agency. So.
You got 11 calls. How come you only responded to 5?
Because some of the calls didn't necessarily make it past where it needed to go for it to be a pesticide complaint. And again, most of those calls came at the sort of beginning of last year's season or mid-season, where we were still sort of hammering out how we were going to sort of follow up with these. So for example, I think the call actually that Ken was talking about with the starvation in June or July, so that was a call that came in and they thought it was pesticide related, and then Ken went out and it was starvation. So we didn't follow up on that. So things like that. So we collect all bee kill calls, whether we follow information, whether it's deemed pesticide related or not, whether we follow up with it or not. And basically, all that information goes to EPA at the end of the year anyways. So EPA wants to know about it, and all of our investigations that are bee kill related, copies of those investigations go to EPA at the end of the year as well.
Do you also get a copy, because if you're an applicator, you have to file a pesticide report every year with the state.
Yes.
So they therefore could match those reports up with areas,
We could, but...
Do they ever cross-reference them? Do they ever, because you, as a licensed
Yeah.
applicator, you have to report what you're using, how much you used, when you used it, where you used it.
So there's sort of two different things. What you're submitting at the end of the year is your annual report, which at the time wouldn't be helpful for a pesticide kill. So you've reported what you used for last year. You do have to keep an individual application record, which yes, we are going to ask for that if we feel that there could have been some correlation. It's complex. They're tricky. They're very tricky. But I'm really glad to say that the apiary program and the pesticide program have really sort of joined forces on trying to tackle this and try to get as much information as we possibly can when these things come in. And they're not easy. They're really not easy. But we certainly need to follow up on them if it is, potentially pesticide related. Any other questions? They're almost right on target. This never happens.
I just want to say, because we have mixture in the room.
Yeah.
Some people may not be aware of the IPM program, what happens is a spotter goes on a farm. And they typically go through the farm and they document where there may be a specific pest. And they basically give the farmer like a prescription of what they should do to treat and the dosage, etc. They don't randomly go through a farm and just spray everything. That's the beauty of the IPM program that was started in Massachusetts at UMass, is that it's like going to your doctor and you're getting a prescription. And so we've been able to take and follow the path of where a pest or a disease is going to go through Massachusetts. And so if a spotter finds it on this farm, they know a radius of the range of which that pest may spread outwards. And so they can be watching for it to see where it's moving along. It's been phenomenal for helping farmers prepare for potential pests that could be invading in an area. And it's caused them to use less in chemicals than in past times. And you know, and this is something that we're just trying to make sure you get out to the non-farming community and to know that farmers are not running around spraying broad amounts of pests aside. It's expensive, their families don't want to get coated with it, it's just, and with the IPM program and the great efforts that the department is doing with education, we're just trying to get the word out to exactly, you know, what this IPM is a great opportunity for everyone to understand about a method for how you apply it, and maybe the homeowners will start looking at that as an opportunity. Just don't, prophylactically, as she said, spray something. Understand more about it. So thank you for being here today, for getting this education.
Thank you.
Well, okay, since you put the slide up there about the pollinator protection plan,
Yes.
I'm gonna have to ask, the draft went out without any of the beekeeper stuff in it. Not a single phrase or a point out of the beekeeper's plan was in the draft. So you're in your May to July revision now, and beekeepers sent another document as well. Where are we gonna stand in it all this time? Are we gonna have a voice in this or not?
Of course you guys are gonna have a voice in this. I mean,
We didn't before.
We had 7 listening sessions. We received 2,400 emails. We took all of the 7 listening sessions. I think we had about 100 attendees. We got some phenomenal feedback and suggestions and ideas on the plan. Most of the people that attended those listening sessions and sent in the emails were beekeepers. And so, we're going through those comments right now to see, what we can change of the existing plan to incorporate or adjust or address the concerns of people that commented. Can I give you specifics? No, I can't, because we're not at that point right now. We're still gathering all the comments to put together a document to post as far as these are the comments that we've gotten. Once we get that document together, we can work off of that to update the draft.
I'm not asking for specifics, at this point, but the thing is, both documents that were submitted, the original document that was submitted that was left out of the draft completely, and the subsequent one were signed off on by MassBee and at least 8 county beekeeping association presidents. Now that represents probably 5,000 beekeepers or more. So that really should be carrying some weight here. It's not just one individual comment.
I know.
So.
The beekeepers have been very vocal with their comments and on the plan in all very, very good ways for us to take a look at the plan and make adjustments where we want to make adjustments. And so,
Frankly, the first document, the draft, it was really, seemed like it was authored by the Farm Bureau without any input at all from the beekeepers.
Well,
And that's just not acceptable.
I don't wanna go back and forth about the pollinator plan, because one, that's not what we're here for, but two, I do wanna respect what you have to say. We have heard this multiple times during the listening sessions and through the emails, and so what you're telling me is something that we have already heard, and that we are taking into consideration when we're looking at things.
Well, I agree. I raised the issue because the slide was in the presentation, so therefore it's fair game.
No, that's totally fine. I totally understand.
Okay.
And what you're saying is, we heard that at every single listening session, so everybody was very good at making sure that that was stressed.
And we will continue to do so at every opportunity.
No, I know.
I'm curious as to why glyphosate is not one of the tested chemicals, with Roundup being one of the most widely used pesticides available to consumers and commercial-grade applicators?
Because at this point, so a couple different things, and it's not to say that it won't ever make it up there, but when that screen was put together for sort of going into this season, there wasn't a lot that we were seeing regarding herbicides and pollinators as far as issues that were occurring. And so that's one reason why it wasn't on there. The thing is, I mean, I would love to have every single possible thing on that screen. That is a very large screen. There's about, and there's 40 actives on that, which means time and a lot of money. And unfortunately, we don't have exponential funds when we're dealing with this. And when we're at a bee kill, we can take anywhere from 2 samples to 12 samples. And those samples, when you run large screens like that, can run about $250 more a sample. And so we want to try to make the best with what we have at this point. And given the information that we were finding when we were developing this one, and that's why we also pulled out some things that were some more older chemistries that you're not going to really see very much out there, if at all, is just try to make the best with what we have. Now, it's not to say that that list won't change, but that's one reason why you don't see glyphosate up there at the moment.
You also have national guidance, don't you? You have input from...
Not necessarily for the screens, and I think that's primarily due to the fact that every state's a little different. So, you know, what they're using in Texas might be a lot different than what we're using up here. And so, from a national standpoint, it's nice in one sense, but in another sense, when you start talking about use patterns and chemicals and things like that, it does get very specific. I mean, I've seen other screens from other states that are half the size of that or twice as long as that.
Depends on what they grow and what they grow.
Yeah, and it depends on the resources too that are available for that department, because these are, when it's an investigation, they're free of charge. You know, we're not charging the beekeeper or anything. So resources is another key too, and everybody's resources are different. And so it's really sort of dependent on the state. But
Massachusetts is better than some states for sure, because like, for instance, I don't know if this is the case in Texas, but in this state, I guess the applicator has to at least be able to read the label. That's not always the case.
You gotta read the label. Label is the law.
In this state. Not necessarily true in other states.
Okay, so I don't want to keep you guys much longer, so thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Great season. You know, let me start pesticide, certificate, that's me. Thank you.
Get Ken's,
You're welcome.
get Ken's thing over.
Oh yeah, Ken actually brought an observation, a couple observation items.